Welcome to the good, the bad, and the ugly of all things real estate. And today we are discussing secondary suites. So we're talking about the pros and cons, risks and rewards of having a secondary suite. First of all, some housekeeping. Sign up button on the banner on the top of this page to be added to the mailing list, and that way you'll get the links for the replays. And I might even do transcript. I might even put in I think I'll put in the PDF as well of the presentation. So you can have it all if you sign up for the mailing list. And I do share other interesting and useful information as well. So what is a secondary suite? It is any additional residential unit or dwelling on the property. So you've got your, sometimes it's a main floor suite and an upper level suite. Sometimes it's a basement suite with the rest of the house being the primary dwelling. And there are also garage suites and garden suites, and all of them are fantastic. So let's start with the good of secondary suites. It is an excellent entry point into real estate investing. In fact, that's how we got started. You buy a suited property or buy a house that you can suite. You can live in one suite while renovating and then renting the other. And in Canada, at least, when you're living in the dwelling, you can get a low money down mortgage. So that's how we got started and stretched we had about, I think, $80,000 to start with. And we stretched that into 4 houses, suited houses, instead of only buying one with 20% down. We bought 4. And yeah, lots of moving, but it was worth it. So buy one, live in one suite and rent out the other. And then buy another property and do it all over again. And we did this with a preschooler and a toddler, by the way, so lots of fun. There is a huge increase in your total rent. A single family home would rent for about $2,100, for instance, but that same home with a secondary suite would rent for $2,800 or more. That's a difference of, I believe, $8,400 a year, pure profit. And of course, mortgage qualification is a whole lot easier, especially if you are receiving income to offset your personal mortgage. So if you're living in the one suite, renting out the other, that takes away from your personal debt load that you need to cover. And rent from one suite covers most or often all of the basic expenses, meaning that vacancy in one suite does not necessarily mean you're out of pocket any cash. So if you've got the basement suite vacant, that main floor suite is still going to cover all your expenses. If it's the main floor that's vacant, then the basement suite rent will cover most of them. And one really cool thing, it's extremely rare that you're going to have both suites vacant unless it's a new acquisition, usually. So the utilities are always covered. And at least here in Edmonton, Alberta, where we have fairly cold winters, the utilities can be $300 a month in the winter with nobody living in the property. In fact, even if there's no electricity being used other than the fridge and the furnace turning on, just your basic service charges are over $100 on the electric alone. So yeah, having it covered by one suite is fantastic. We once had 16 simultaneous potential vacancies, and that was covered by our portfolio. So it's absolutely amazing that the cash flow from the rest of your portfolio can cover multiple vacancies. And, I was a little freaked out when we had 3 new builds come online at the same time, all suited and very costly. And so that was 6 vacancies right there. Then if this was in the spring, when we have most of our leases turning over in the spring. So we had a lot of potential turnover. And I was pretty freaked out by 16 possible vacancies until I sat down and ran the numbers and realized that the rest of our portfolio, because it's all either suited or rent to own primarily, it would cover those vacancies. And oh my gosh, it helps you sleep at night. So fantastic suited houses. More good stuff. The resale value is great. It really holds the value even in a flat or falling market. And actually, when we got those 3 new acquisitions, the first mortgage appraisal came back quite low because the single family market had dropped by about 10 to 12%. So the appraisal did not support our purchase price. And when I looked at the comparables that they were using, it was all single family. And this was in the town of Leduc, or city of Leduc, I should say. And there were absolutely no comparable sales for suited houses because people keep them, because they cash flow so well. So there were no comparables. And what I did was I took the comparable sales for Edmonton, which of course they couldn't use, but I demonstrated that yes, single family homes had dropped by 12% in Edmonton, but suited sales held their value and didn't drop at all. So all those properties with secondary suites were holding their value, even though the rest were falling. And that was enough for them to recalculate their appraisal, and we had no problem getting a mortgage. So absolutely fantastic. And in a boom where you have people who can't afford to get into their own house, you know, you've got houses that have gone up 30% in the last 2 years, and people are having trouble affording it. But that mortgage helper, that secondary suite, helps people get into the housing market. And in fact, that's how we sold our first suited home, was to somebody wanting that mortgage helper. They're always attractive to investors if they're legally suited, of course, and well maintained and in a good area. Always attractive to investors. So the resale is fantastic. They are also attractive to tenants. Some investors don't believe this, but I can tell you it's true. Oops, sorry about that. First of all, it costs the same amount to heat a house and a basement, regardless of how many people are living in there. And so the tenants get the benefit of a shared heating cost. They get to live in a nicer property or a nicer area than they could otherwise afford. And we have quite a few tenants who love this, this aspect to it. In fact, we just had a couple young ladies move in who had been renting 2 tiny little 1-bedroom apartments, and they switched to this gorgeous 1,400 square foot main floor suite, hardwood floors, granite countertops. They're paying the same rent as they did for these 2 little 1-bedroom apartments, and they get to live in a fantastic property in a fantastic area for the same rent. You have security for tenants who work out of town. A lot of our tenants, especially in basement suites, are people who they want their own place. They don't want a roommate, but they also don't want to stay in a townhouse or something where it's obvious that the place is vacant. So they know that with an upper floor tenant, they've always got somebody who's keeping an eye on things. And 2 sets of tenants get to share the yard work. You don't have to shovel all the snow yourself. So any questions about the good aspects? I know there are more good aspects you probably know as well, but you know, we're not going to reveal absolutely everything today. So, all right, no questions? Okay. Now, there are some bad things about secondary suites. And the first one is that it is unattractive in certain ways to some tenants, and some aspects are just unattractive to everybody. Parking is one issue, as you can see by the picture. But first, the shared yard, especially if one tenant has dogs and doesn't pick up immediately after their dogs. And let's say the other tenant has young children or any children, and they want, or even just themselves, and they want to enjoy the yard. Not as enjoyable if it's full of dog feces. And parking is a problem in some cases, especially with zero clearance lots, and I will never, ever buy one again. What a zero clearance lot is that the property line comes right up to one of your walls of your house, and then on the other side, you only have the absolute minimum distance. It's, I don't know, 4 feet or something like that. It's ridiculous. You can barely get a lawnmower between these houses, which means there is almost no street parking. And in one of our properties, there would be enough room, but of course, that's where the fire hydrant is. So the only parking is the garage and the driveway. And if you've got one tenant renting the entire garage, that means they also get the entire driveway. So what we do with that is we have a clause in our lease that if one tenant is renting the entire garage, they must make accommodations for the other tenant to park on the driveway, or at least be able to plug in the cases where it's extreme cold. Let's get this going. Sound transfer can be an issue. If you have no soundproofing, obviously it's going to be an issue. But even with soundproofing, there still will be some sound transfer. If people walk around in clickety-clackety high-heeled shoes, dogs barking, any kind of deep bass, and kids banging on the floor, all of those things will come through to some extent. So even with great soundproofing, there is the possibility of sound transfer. Smoking, if one tenant is smoking, and I mean, we have all non-smoking buildings, it's right in the lease, no smoking, no vaping, no incense, because those smells, even if you have separate heating systems, those smells can transfer. And sometimes people don't obey the rules, so then that can be an issue. More bad aspects to secondary suites, they are only allowed in certain areas. Some municipalities don't allow them at all, and in some cases there are very strict rules. For instance, in Edmonton, it used to be that they had to be on a corner lot, they had to be or an area with a service road, not only directly on the main road. There are a couple other qualifications, but all of those restrictions have since been removed. But yes, they definitely were a thing back in the day, and not that long ago, only 10 years ago. So things have really changed. Your suites should be registered with the municipality. So registered, licensed, legalized, however you want to say it. And legalization can be very expensive. In one case, we ended up having all sorts of things that we didn't expect. This was the first suite that we legalized. So it was an existing suite. And at that time in Edmonton, the rules were that you didn't have to have a new furnace installed if it was an existing suite back from, before 2006 or something like that. But so even with not having to put in a second furnace, there were all kinds of things that we didn't expect that ended up having to be done, including redoing the railing outside, because the entrance to the basement suite was underneath the stairs to the upper suite, and the railings had little crossbars on them, so that could be a climbing hazard, and so we had to replace the railing. That was definitely and that was about $2,500, so an unexpected expense. So definitely be very thorough in checking things out. And your contractor must know the requirements like the back of his hand. So you want a contractor who's going to do the legalization, who knows the rules inside and out. And ideally, when you're buying a property, when you're doing the home inspection, so you've already got the offer put down, you're doing the home inspection, get your contractor to come with you and get him to write up the list of what needs to be done, get him to put in the quotes and everything. And also, here's a little tip for you. You can get permission from the current owner of the property to apply for your permits now. And that way you can start working the day you get possession. Fantastic idea, no time wasted. Careful tenant selection is critical. You have to do more thorough screening. You need to find tenants who are going to be responsible and respectful. For instance, things like sharing in the yard work and picking up after their dogs and being careful about noise transfer. You definitely want to be really picky with your tenants, but we've never had an issue. And more bad news, there can be management issues. If you have tenants who don't get along, one tenant doing all the yard work. Oh, and a simple example of the tenants not getting along is the heating system. If it is one heating system and one tenant likes the heat either really high or really low, that is going to cause discomfort for your other tenant. We always provide additional space heaters for the downstairs tenants. But in one case, we had a tenant upstairs who was from a very hot country in Africa, and he had the thermostat set to 27 degrees. So there really wasn't any fixing that. The downstairs tenants had everything taped off, and it was still just sweltering. Parking issues, as we mentioned before, and utility payments. Utility payments can be an issue in two different ways. In one case, if somebody likes the heat at 27 degrees, that they should be paying a higher share, so you could have issues that way. But biggest issue that I've heard of, and I've never done this, is when the landlord decides that one tenant will have the heat in his name and the other tenant will have the electricity in her name. And then they have to figure it out. That's a recipe for disaster. Just keep all the utility bills in your name, have a separate utility agreement that's an addendum to your lease, and make that utility agreement subject to adjustment. And that solves all the issues, well, basically. There can be higher turnover, but not necessarily. If you have, so the higher turnover comes in primarily because a lot of people stay in a secondary suite or a suited house because they want to save money to buy their own house, for instance, or they're in school, so they want to save money. So those tenants are likely going to leave once they've finished school or once they're buying a house. But then you've got your other tenants who are people who want to live in that nicer property without paying the full house rent, or single parents. We've had a lot of divorced parents who the kid may reside with them only part-time, full-time, but it's a great way for them to save money. And those tenants stay for a long time. We've had tenants actually in that 1,400 square foot bungalow. The basement suite is also 1,400 square feet, 3 bedrooms, 2 full bathrooms. And we've had those tenants since we bought the place, 9 years in a basement suite. They love it. They don't want to ever leave. It does take more management effort to find suitable tenants. So your letting fee for your management company might be a little higher. And it could end up that you have a little vacancy because you're waiting for the right tenant. Does anyone have any questions? Okay. And the ugly. Management issues can also get ugly. And instead of tenants not getting along, you can have tenants feuding. This has only happened to us once because, and it was way back when, we had a tenant who on paper and in meeting her seemed like she'd be perfect. And she's one of those people who, as soon as she got into the place, she just showed her true colors. So she slipped through the cracks and got in there and caused no end of trouble. But, oh, speaking of which, always, if you have the option, always use a fixed term lease, meaning a lease that has a scheduled end date. And in Alberta, at least, when that lease comes to the end date, you, the landlord, get to choose whether you renew or not. So in this case, we chose not to. You can have he said, she said sort of things, and you're stuck in the middle, and then what do you do? So that can be ugly. And if you have an unregistered or illegal suite, that can be shut down by the municipality. So if you're counting on that extra income and suddenly the municipality is alerted to the secondary suite, they do an inspection, they say, in some cases, they say this isn't allowed, take it out, or they'll say, here's what you need to do to legalize it. And perhaps it's too costly for you to do. But regardless, that secondary suite tenant is going to have to be gone while you do some major renovations, even if it is allowed. So that's better to always have it legalized or registered. And if you do have spiteful tenants or ex-tenants, they may report the unregistered suite and force you to shut down. So that's never happened to us, but I've heard of it happening. So something to be aware of with illegal suites. And keep in mind, if you do have a property that is causing you no end of trouble and headaches, just ditch it, get rid of it, and take the money and invest it in a different property in a different location. The first property that we had, that we put the suite in, we ended up selling it to that young man who needed the mortgage helper and made a tidy profit on it because we sold it during the boom. And plus we had added huge value by putting in that secondary suite, huge value. So we sold that one because it just felt like that property was cursed. We had bad tenant after bad tenant. So these, for instance, one set of tenants, they were super nice people. They were wonderful, except it turned out that they were kind of alcoholics. And so they were drinking their rent, basically. We showed up at their door to ask about rent one day, and this was 10 o'clock in the morning, and the woman answered the door with a Caesar in her hand, and she was pretty wobbly. So it was just one thing after another. There were foundation issues that, oh, speaking of picking the good contractor, so there was a crack in the foundation, and we asked if it had been sealed before they finished it and put the suite in for us. We asked if the crack had been sealed, and they said yes. Then we had terrible groundwater flooding that year, and it was like Swiss cheese. The water was just spraying through like a spray park. Turns out they sealed it with Kills stain sealant. They didn't seal it with that epoxy or anyway, cursed property. So we fixed the issues before we sold it, but we just sold it. We'd had enough. All right. And so there's the bright side is brighter than the ugly, that's for sure. So on the bright side, you have excellent cash flow with very few hassles if you have careful tenant selection. And a well-maintained suite in a decent area will attract better tenants and make management and resale easier. So make sure you buy right. And as I mentioned, solid resale potential in any market. And that is it. Remember to sign up on the banner upstairs there of this page to get the replays and a copy of the presentation. And if you're already on the mailing list, you will receive the replay link, so you don't need to sign up again. And that is it. All right, well, thank you for joining me. And I haven't set the date yet for the next one, but please put in the comments which topic you would like to be discussed, whether it's renovations, fix and flip, RSP mortgages, agreements for sale, anything you want, we'll make sure we cover it. And if it's not in my area of expertise, I have so many real estate friends, and I'm thinking of one specifically for fix and flip because I've only done one. So we'll bring in some experts and make sure that we get your questions answered and get these topics covered. All right, we'll talk to you soon. And watch the page for information on the next session. I'm thinking middle of next week. Okay, bye for now.